Okay, hello and welcome back to Set in Stone History Podcast. I'm Charlie and today I'm joined by Dex. Unfortunately, this episode was supposed to be with Neith, but she's a bit under the weather today, so I'm stuck with Dex.
Stuck with me? Hang on a minute, right? I've got more experience with than Neith at this. Though I suppose I shouldn't be chatting too much about her, given that she's our editor and she's looking down upon us as we speak.
Yeah, she'll just edit this and make you seem, I don't know.
I work to make you proud, Neith. I hope you know this.
Yes, so despite that, we're talking about Grey's Monument. And luckily for me, Dex knows very minimal about this, so I'm just going to have to teach him a few things.
Indeed.
Okay, so I'll start with the actual monument itself. It's located at the top of Grey's Street and Granger Street in Newcastle. And for my money, it's probably the most iconic statue in Newcastle. I mean, it's hard to miss it. It's 134 foot tall, yes. It was supposed to be 150 foot, but it just didn't get enough money. So that's an interesting little tidbit. So at the top of the column is a statue of Earl Charles Grey, who was a local politician who became Prime Minister from 1830 to 1834. So the foundation stone of the monument was laid on the 6th of September 1837, and it took almost a year to complete in August 1838. Underneath the foundation stone, there's a time capsule containing a drawing of the monument, a list of subscribers to its erection, and a collection of coins, medals, and tokens. So there you go.
Time capsules are always cool. I've always meant to do one, but I've never thought what would actually matter. You know what I mean?
I like the concept, but it's also, when do you open it?
Yeah, exactly. That's another big thing. When is enough time for people, and who decides?
And especially if this was underneath the foundation stone, so you'd have to remove the foundation stone to get to the time capsule. So
what's the point of it then?
I don't know. We'll have to ask whoever designed it and built it. Okay, so why was the monument built? It was built to commemorate Earl Grey and the Reform Act that he headed while he was the Prime Minister. So, in the 1830s, there was a feel that parliamentary reform was needed, as the current system was massively unfair and just hadn't been modernised. So, before the reform, the UK was made up of these things called rotten boroughs. And these boroughs, better known as constituencies, would contain 2 elected MPs for Parliament, while as towns such as Manchester, who'd been massively expanding recently at the time, had no MPs whatsoever to represent them. So it was just massively unfair and didn't give a lot of people representation in Parliament.
This is a weird thing in history. It blows my mind looking back at places like Manchester, which is pretty significant today, and being like
second biggest city in the UK,
something like that.
Something like that.
It's really odd just looking back at it and being like, it was developing.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's such a
mental.
huge city. I was there
in my mind. It's always been there, and it's always been as big as it were.
It is interesting. That's why we like history. That's why we're doing this. Okay, so the PM before Grey was Arthur Wellesley, who was a Tory, and he was completely opposed to reform. But even in the Tory party, there were still thoughts that reform was needed, but they obviously didn't want massive changes because it definitely favoured them. But when the Tory government lost power in 1830, Earl Grey, who was a Whig, became the Prime Minister. So Earl Grey and the Whig Party were pro-reform. They had 2 attempts at reform that just weren't passed through Parliament before the third was passed in 1832. And this is the Representation of the People Act, the main reform that the monument was built to commemorate. So what did it do? The Representation of the People Act, 1832, disenfranchised 56 boroughs in England and Wales and reduced another 31 to only 1 MP. It created 67 new constituencies. It broadened the franchise's property qualifications in the countries to include small landowners, tenant farmers, and shopkeepers. It created a uniform franchise in the boroughs, giving the vote to all householders who paid a yearly rental of £10 or more, and some lodgers. The Representation of the People Act, it proved that reforms were possible, and they continued to happen following the Reform Act, which is probably one of the best things about the Reform Act itself, is it inspired new Reform Acts to follow it. So Earl Grey himself, he was born in Northumberland in 1764 and died in 1845. And he has 2 main legacies, really. Obviously the Reform Act that we've just talked about, and Earl Grey Tea, which has nothing on Yorkshire tea, in my opinion.
Yeah, I 100% back you there. Yorkshire tea is, well, in my opinion, it's the only tea in the world.
The best tea in the world, by far. It's not there's no competition.
We're not sponsored, by the way.
Yet.
Just saying. Yet, yeah.
Us.
We will continue this forever if you do.
Oh, 100%.
Any statue you name, we'll cover it.
Okay, so I'll just say a little bit about Earl Grey Tea, unfortunately. So it's a blend of tea and bergamot oil. So he got this as a gift, and he liked it so much that he asked British merchants to recreate it, and boom, Earl Grey Tea was born. Grey, as a person, he was seen as a good person, and it can be evidenced in the actual writings on the monument, which describe Grey as a constant advocate of peace and the fearless and consistent champion of civil and religious liberty. So, pretty sound guy by all accounts. Now we're going to talk about the controversies.
Yes, hello, my favourite part of these episodes. So, of course, we've discussed this. I'm here on very, very short notice. I knew very little before I had to come here and discuss it with you. And when we were discussing it, sort of, well, educating me, really, I struggled to think of what controversies could potentially be there. I always try to predict it. And it's always things like, oh, there's probably like vandalism or something. He's like a really old geezer, maybe like sexism or racism comes into it.
They're the first things you think of when you think of someone from that sort of time period.
Yeah, and I was happily surprised to see that the statue itself is pretty much controversial free. There's a couple of things I want to touch on, but I think the important things for the controversies is to touch on the Great Reform Act itself of 1832, also known as the the Great
Representation of the People Act.
Representation of the People Act. There was one more.
Yeah, the First Reform Act.
Yeah,
there you go.
So, at face value, it sounds like a great thing, right? It's getting more people involved in politics. It's trying to make politics more fair. But you mentioned that you had to, if you was allowed, it gave the right to vote to landowners as long as their rent was £10 a year, which for me and you, £10 nothing.
Back then, it was a considerable amount of money.
Yeah, to put it in context, you were in the middle class if you were paying £10 a year.
Yeah. Which,
unfortunately, left all of the working class in the dust. Newcastle and a lot of the north being working class. Yeah. You can see it as controversial as, even though Charles Earl Grey was from Northumberland, he's from the north, having a statue that represents an act that only benefited the middle class and didn't benefit the working class, that can be seen as a bit dicey, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it just didn't go far enough.
No, not at all. It didn't reach... It reached a large audience, but it needed to do better, though that could be counteracted with your point of, well, it would lead to future acts.
Yeah.
But another thing I want to touch on is that specifically in writing on the act, it specifically states that a voter has to be male.
Yes.
So I want to bring up a technicality here, which, take it as you will, I think it's a pretty interesting fact and a pretty unfortunate fact. Before this point, women in England and Britain technically had the right to vote. It was just extremely uncommon.
Yes.
This took away that right. Women were not allowed to vote by the Great Reform Act of 1832.
Yeah, essentially, women had very little political power before this act, and it removed that tiny bit of power that they had. So that is definitely unfortunate.
So not only is it not reaching a wide enough audience, it's limiting its own audience. It's it's removing the political rights of women, something that I think everybody knows women had to struggle for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
But apart from that, I couldn't find anything else controversial. That seems to be it, and I don't want to sound, bigoted or anything, but I think it's important to look at history from the time.
Yes.
Charles Earl Grey is a Whig, and there's something called Whig history, and they always think about history from the present. I don't believe in that. I think it's important to look at from the present and from the time itself, and I think from the time, this was progressive.
It was definitely progressive. I would agree with that.
So I think I couldn't stand here and say, well, the statue shouldn't be there. The Reform Act was bad because of today's standards. It would have been much better, and I think the removal of rights for women was a huge step back.
Yeah. But
you've got to give it some credit with, it was actively trying to bring in reforms that the former Prime Minister wasn't.
Yeah.
Whilst it wasn't touching its working class audience, it was touching all of its middle class, which will then eventually go into, reforms for the working class and this sort of thing. But now I teased this at the start. I want to talk about controversies for the statue itself, the physical statue. I couldn't find any evidence of vandalism or anything by people.
No.
But here's a question, Charlie. Can Mother Nature vandalize?
That is a very philosophical question.
It is.
I'm going to say yes.
Oh, excellent. Well, in that case, I do have an evidence of vandalism. In 1941, Grey's monument was struck by lightning.
Lightning. Okay.
The big sky boom, big yellow thing.
Yep.
And his head was taken completely off his shoulders.
Wow.
Until 1947. So for 6 years, Charles Earl Grey was headless.
Crikey.
His head was eventually repaired in 47 by Roger Headley.
Fitting name.
Yeah, fitting name. And I just think that's hilarious. It's not really controversial. I guess the controversy in that is, why did it take so long to rebuild?
Yes.
My answer would be the war effort, maybe?
That would make sense. On that topic, I would also bring in, why didn't it receive enough funding to be built to 150 foot, planned?
Yeah, that's a good point. In terms of the war effort, we're obviously referencing World War II.
Yes.
And with the funding, how large originally did it want to be, sorry? Was it 150?
50. So most of it was built. It got to 134, but...
I think that's large enough, to be honest.
I agree.
Maybe that was the point.
Maybe
we're looking into it a bit deep. Maybe they just looked at it and went, bloody hell, that's a bit too big, isn't it?
That is also true, but I did find that it was not... It was due to the fact that they just didn't raise enough money. So maybe either the people thought, we don't need it to be that much bigger, or because of how little the reforms actually helped the people of Newcastle,
they didn't want to help the statue.
That's
an interesting point.
Food for thought.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Another point I want to touch upon is what I see as controversial. Unfortunately, you're probably going to disagree with me here, Charlie. Grey's Monument, it's so prominent, as you said. It's its own little area. When you say, oh, I'm going to meet you at Monument Station, it's named after the statue. So a lot of protests and activists and street performers and all this always engage outside of Grey's, because there's always a large audience listening. And there's been a lot of unfortunate protests and such, like the anti-vax movement. I've got nothing against people who are anti-vax. I just think it's a little bit dangerous how it inspires all these conflicting ideals to promote their ideas.
Okay, and
in the same location.
I will just say, yes, some protests can be controversial, but I think it's within everyone's right to protest. Even if what they're protesting is controversial, they're still well within their right to do that. And having a place like Grey's Monument, which is such a pillar, no pun intended, for change and reform in Newcastle, it does make sense for people to protest there. And
yeah, no, I totally agree with that point. My worry just stems from the amount of ideas that are shared there. They're always conflicting, it seems. Though on Remembrance Day, the Remembrance Day parade passed Monument, and I wasn't there for the parade itself, but I was by Monument when it was going on. The crowds were absolutely wild. And it shows that it doesn't matter what event it is, the statue itself is significant. It's significant for this change that we keep discussing.
Yes, and I'm very glad you brought this up because I do have a bit to say about this. So,
Oh, brilliant.
the statue is massively significant in terms of it being just a large statue in a meeting place. It's very iconic, as I said. And as you said, people say, oh, I'll meet you at Monument. Like, it's a common meeting place. It's a landmark of the city. It's hard to miss.
Yeah, I don't know how you could miss it. Fun fact, I didn't know there was a person on top of it the first time I saw it.
Neither did I, because you don't really look that high up.
Yeah, what's the point in looking that high?
Okay, that's a big pole. Nice. But it is more significant than just where it's located and how big it is. It is, as I said, like a landmark for reform and change. And I think, as we said, there are some controversial movements, but on a whole, most of them have been really good. Like in 2018, there was a march to raise support for the NHS. Just last month, in December 2021, just to date the episode, there was the Reclaim the Night March, which is, again, a very important movement. There's been anti-Trump rallies, women's marches, you name it, all the somewhat controversial in some, like, I don't know, anti-Trump, you know. Obviously, some people would disagree with that.
Yeah, people have got opinions on that.
People have opinions on that, definitely. But I think it's become a centre for reform in the city. And I think that's so important now.
It is just a symbol for progress at this point,
exactly.
Right?
And I feel like it's created almost a new history for itself. It's moved on from why it was built originally, like the Reform Act, while it was important at the time. Now, it's not so important. And the new history that's been surrounded the monument since its creation is so much more important and relevant, in my opinion. And also, a fun little bit of information was when Nigel Farage came to Newcastle.
Here we go.
He was hit by a rogue milkshake just in front of Grace Monument. So, if you didn't love it already, you should now.
I think your point of, well, obviously, I think the milkshake point is 10 out of 10.
Brilliant.
We should just end here. But no, I think your point of, what I find really interesting is you've sort of subtracted the original meaning of the statue and you've argued it's got new life, it's got new meaning. And I think that is really interesting. There was an old quote from, I think it was the Angel of the North episode, where it says, like, a sculpture is an evolving thing, or something like that. I can't quite remember it now, unfortunately. And I think what you've just said defines that perfectly. It's got new representation, it's got new history, and it's bringing about new positive change for our time. Because I'm sure 100 years down the line, maybe there's two students in a university who will look at it from their point of view and be like, oh, that reform wasn't enough.
Yeah.
So I think that's a pretty interesting point.
I think, that's kind of that's my thought process of it. And we'll get into my opinion in a little bit more, but that's kind of my basic opinion. So I'll just talk about how it was received when it was built. So obviously, as we mentioned, it profited the middle class most. So they loved it. But it did kind of create a little bit of a divide between the lower and the middle classes. So, because obviously the lower class, the working class, it created more separation between them and the middle classes. They now couldn't.
Well, they didn't have the right to vote.
Exactly.
That was a huge change.
Exactly. And obviously the upper class, they saw it as a bit too dangerous and radical, which to us sounds a bit ridiculous because it didn't go anywhere near far enough. But for them, they sort of saw it as it's taking power away from them, which I guess it technically did. But it was about time. Anyway.
You're not holding any punches back today, see?
No, I'm just saying it how it is. Okay, so my opinion now that we'll get into this, a bit disjointed the way I've laid this out.
Oh, it's fine. We're having fun, right?
Yeah. I think the basis is the monument is so much more important than just Earl Grey. And I think the fact that, as we said, you didn't even notice he was there, it says a lot. Like, it's not about him anymore. It is it was built to commemorate him and what he stands for, like with reform and change and being an advocate for civil liberties. Great. But the actual Reform Act didn't go far enough, and now the monument represents so much more than that, and I think that's great.
I fully agree.
Yeah.
I think, for me, before we started this podcast and did our research on these statues, monument to me was an area. It wasn't a statue, it was the place with multiple metro stations, couple of shops.
Yeah.
You know, it was a meeting place. It's a place where people, you know, sing, protest, etc, etc. And I think that, as you said, that is what the statue has become. And I really do appreciate that. It's very you don't need to think about the complicated history behind the statue in order to see the positive vibes it brings, I guess.
Yeah.
So no, I'd agree that it's a good thing.
And an interesting thing that I kind of regret not doing now would have been to ask just random people in Newcastle what they see it as. And I guarantee no one will say, oh, it was built because of the Reform Act. It was built because of, well, maybe they'll know it's Earl Grey Tea, it's Grey's monument. But I imagine the majority of people will see it as a symbol for change and a symbol for reform, not as the Great Reform Act of 1832.
That would have been a really interesting comparison with Kate's point of the spirit of Jarrow. Kate mentioned everyone and their mother knows where that statue is and knows what it means.
Yes.
It would have been really interesting to compare the Grey's monument and see what people really knew about it.
Yeah, so unfortunately I didn't do that, but we move on. And I think, unless you've got anything else to say, I've just about covered everything I wanted to talk about.
No, it's been an education for me as much as it has been for our viewers. I've got nothing else to add.
Good. Well, I'm glad you learned a few things. And, well, I guess thank you for listening. This has been the Set in Stone podcast. If you're interested in anything we have covered today, please check the description where there'll be a full bibliography. Please let us know if you have any thoughts in the comments. And, again, thank you for listening.
Yep, we'll see you all later. Thank you very much and take care.